Happy Sabbath, everybody.
Happy Sabbath.
I think we have some new people here that weren't here last night. We have some people that were here last night who aren't here today. So we just want to do a brief review of what we went through yesterday evening. Who wasn't here yesterday? Just one person? Okay. So we began our study by looking at Revelation chapter 10. Revelation chapter 10, if we turn there, speaks of an angel coming down from heaven, clothed with all the symbology of the covenant. Verse 1, and I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as the pillars of fire. The symbology there indicates that it's Jesus, but I want us to pick up that there's a rainbow. There's a covenant that's been entered into at this juncture where this angel comes down. He had in his hand a little book open, and he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot on the earth. He cried with a loud voice as when a lion roareth, and when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. So we picked up the symbology here. We've got these 2 feet of this angel coming down, and it's 1 foot on the land and 1 foot on the sea. And if we were to turn to manuscript 59, 1900, which is in your study notes, if you've got a study Bible, I should say, it's in there. It says, the mighty angel who instructed John was no less a personage than Jesus Christ, setting his right foot on the sea and his left upon the dry land, showing the part which he is acting in the closing scenes of the great controversy with Satan. This position denotes his supreme authority, his supreme power and authority over the whole earth. So we read that far, we didn't go any further. So our first premise is that this is not a real angel that's coming down. Because real angels can't stretch that high, they're not that big. And the position denotes a number of things. What did we say it denotes when we looked at this last night? Remember? The closing scenes. Closing scenes would take you to where? The end of the world. So we're at the end of the world, we know that. And it's also speaking about showing his great authority over the controversy. So this position of land and sea is indicating his supreme authority. We put those 2 thoughts together. It's his supreme authority at the end of the world. Hopefully we could see that. We didn't read in this passage. We could have read another passage that also talks about this message going worldwide. It's a worldwide message. So we have these different components that are being brought to view here. And I'm suggesting that what's being portrayed is the role of Christ through his people as they begin to make battle against the kingdom of Satan. It's going to be located in 2 particular places. One is in Europe and one is in the United States. The sea that is being portrayed here is the symbol of Europe. And how did we come to that conclusion? Where did we go to? Our main reference point. There's different places that you could go to work that out. Do you remember? World power. We went to Revelation 17. Revelation 17, we see that there's a woman who's sitting upon many waters. And those waters, another symbol of the sea, are a symbol of what? People. So that's verse 15, my sisters quoted, Revelation 17:15, which we didn't read, but we'll read that. And he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest where the whore sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. Now, at the end of the world, that becomes a worldwide phenomena. But if we went to the beginning of Revelation 17, and we were to understand the context of what's being discussed here, if we went to verse 3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. So 17 verse 3, Johnny's been taken into the wilderness when he begins to see this woman and the beast on which she's sitting. So that was verse 3. If we go to verse 1, 17:1, just cutting into the verse, it says, I will show thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. So Johnny's going to be shown the judgment that's going to come upon the whore who sits on many waters. And she sits on these waters throughout this whole chapter. Hopefully we can see that. But he's going to take us back to a place which is in the wilderness, which is verse 3. So this word wilderness is a symbol. And what is it a symbol of? So the wilderness is a symbol of the 1260-year papal persecution, and we get that from Revelation chapter 12. The woman in chapter 12, which is God's church, not the same woman, fled into the wilderness, into her place for 1260 years. So we know that in Revelation 17, this whore who's sitting on the many waters, verse 1, is sitting on these waters in the time period of the 1260. Yes? Can we make that connection? Now, in the 1260, so it's a long time period. It's, well over 1,000 years. You go back to the 500s, the 6th century, I think you'd call that. We know that this woman is not ruling the whole world, literally the whole world. It's really focused upon Europe. So that's the logic to say here, this woman sitting in Europe in the original context that Revelation 17 is bringing us to. Revelation 17 is going to take us all the way from this history here, the 1260, all the way to the end of the world. It covers a large span of history, shows the relationship between this woman and whom. It tells you in verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of their fornication. So this woman, this whore, has relationship with the kings of the earth. And when did it begin? In the framework of Revelation 17, the way it's portrayed here. If you go to verse 3, it says the wilderness. We can see that. So it's going from, but if I were to draw it here, it would be the wilderness to, I'll call it the time of the end, because the time of the end is a period of time. This we've just shown here. So the wilderness history plus the time of the end. This would be 538, my brother just said, to 1798, to Daniel 12:1. Covers all of this span of history. Hopefully we can see that. If we were to read really, really carefully about this beast, which we haven't even discussed, which has 7 heads and 10 horns, we'd actually see that this relationship between the woman and the beast stretches way back into eternity, backwards, way back into history, long before 538. But the focus that we're making here is 538 to Daniel 12:1, the wilderness and the time of the end. So once we've made that connection, what we can begin to see is that there's this history, which I'm going to call history number 1, and there's this history, which I'm going to call history number 2. 2 histories which are seamlessly dovetailed in Revelation 17. They just flow from one into the other in this seamless way. And it's a careful reading of Revelation 17 that would allow us to unpick where that transition happens and how it happens. So when we looked at this yesterday, we saw that this woman here was sitting on the beast in the 1260, which is Europe. We made that connection. Hopefully we can all remember that. So you can see that this history that I've shown here graphically is this history here, number 1, where she's sitting in the wilderness on top of this beast, the European powers, the kings of Europe. We can see the same imagery being brought to view here on this chart, the 1843 chart. When you get right down to the bottom, the feet of iron and clay, you see it marks here the 10 kingdoms. And if you go and check the history here that's being portrayed, it's the European powers. This is Daniel chapter 7. So we're getting multiple chapters, multiple books, looking at the same story just in slightly different ways. You know that there were 10 European powers, 3 of them were plucked up, leaving 7, and those 7 horns of Daniel chapter 7 are nothing more than the kings of the earth in Revelation 17. Same story, which is this history here. So we could put the 7 kings of Europe here, which are the kings of the earth. So we've got that history tied down, hopefully. Then we're going to deal with the USA. Now the USA isn't in this history from 538 to 1798. The United States begins to rise out of the earth just before 1798. But by the time you get to 1798, it then becomes the means by which this whore is going to begin to continue to interact and do what? Sit on many waters or have fornication with the kings of the earth. Hopefully we can see that connection. In 1798, there aren't many kings. There's only one king, the United States. So you're going to have to see some development from 1798 onwards where this woman's going to begin to take control not only of the United States, but the whole of the world, or the kings of the earth. So we want to make and see how that connection is put together. But first, here in this history, in 1798, what we're going to see is that she's not going to do this work by herself. She's going to begin to use her daughters. How do we know that she has daughters? Because in verse 5, she's called a mother of harlots. So I wanted us to see that. When she's called the mother of harlots in verse 5, it's taken us to a place just here, just before 1798. So I'll mark verse 5 here. Just before 1798, she's already the mother of harlots. So she has a number of daughters. Now, one of her daughters is not a harlot. One of her daughters is not a harlot. Which daughter would that be? The one who's not a harlot? Just here. Someone said Protestantism. In fact, all of her daughters are Protestants. They're all Protestantism, like the Lutherans, the Baptists, the Methodists. All of them are Protestants, all of her daughters. But one of those is not. The Millerites. So I'll just say Protestant America, if we could use it, conceptualize it that way. So from this history to this history, one of her daughters that lives in Europe is going to leave home and move to America. And what's the historical title of the group of people that do that work? What are they called? The Pilgrim Fathers, yes? A chapter is devoted to them, at least one chapter in the Great Controversy. The Pilgrim Fathers. So the Pilgrim Fathers are one of these daughters who jumps ship, if you like, goes from Europe to America to start a new life away from whom? Her mother. They want to leave the mother. because the mother runs a brothel and they want to leave. So if you can conceptualize it that way, so this is Protestant America. It's not so much the Millerites. Sorry? Someone say something? Oh, okay, I thought I heard someone say something. So this is Protestant America that's leaving home. We can conceptualize it that way, but in Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, chapter 2 specifically, what's the name of this church? It's called Sardis. Yes? So Sardis is Protestant America that's going to leave Europe. So we made that connection. But in Revelation 17, it's not called Europe, is it? Where this whore operates or rules is not Europe, it's what? It's called Babylon, because in verse 5 she's called Mystery Babylon. So this wilderness place, in fact the wilderness is not a place, it's a time. We've just defined it up here. Just want to make sure we understand that. This is Europe. And Europe is being identified as Babylon. So what are the Protestant fathers, so the Pilgrim Fathers, what are they doing? They're leaving Babylon. So as they leave Babylon, they go from Babylon into a different country or into a different land. And we could do a nice study on that to identify what land that they're going to go into. Another way of expressing this same thought, thinking about a totally different history, is we could think of Europe as being the world. Talks about in verse 3, the kings of the earth. The earth is the world. So they're going to leave the world and they're going to go to a different country. Now when I say the world, I don't mean literally the whole globe. I'm thinking about worldliness, if we want to express it that way. Now, if we were to go back into the Exodus story, what country or nation would exemplify worldliness? Egypt. So another way of expressing it is that Europe is not only Babylon, it could also be considered as Egypt. So if you go back to the story of Moses, when they leave Egypt, where are they headed to? Canaan, which is the promised land. So it's the land that was designed by God to be given to his people. This was the land of hope and freedom, not subjugation and servitude, which is what Europe had become. They'd become slaves to the system, if we could call it that. So they're going to leave Egypt and they're going to go to the promised land. Now, we can use various terms to use for the promised land, but as my sister said, one of them is this land that was the most glorious country in the world. But how big is the world in the Old Testament? It's not the whole world. It doesn't include Australia and South America. It's the Middle East. Now, if you go to Israel today, it may not look as glorious as it used to because of perhaps climate change. But back in those days, this was one of the most beautiful lands in the known world then, the land of Canaan. The land of? The pleasant land, yes. So they're going to go from Egypt to the pleasant land, or we're going to call it the glorious land. And Ellen White has something to say about the United States, that this land was the place of refuge for God's dispersed people. They flocked to the United States because here they could find religious tolerance. So the United States can now be identified, and we've done it for a long time in this movement, Daniel 11 verse 41, as being the glorious land, the land that God's people fled to. But when they fled to this land, this was the land that they're going to from Egypt. You can make that connection. You go from Egypt to the promised land. So we've got the story of Moses, Egypt to the glorious land. But in the story of Moses, this is the land of promise, the land that was given or promised to their forefather Abraham. Did he really ever take possession of it properly? He didn't. It was all by promise. So we have one story that you go from Egypt to the glorious land, which is a land of promise. We can see that. Yes? That's using the symbol of Egypt. But yesterday we used the symbol not of Egypt, but of what? Babylon. We used Babylon. Now, if you think about the story of Babylon, this is not the beginning of ancient Israel. This is well into their history. They've been in the glorious land for hundreds of years. They're going to get taken out of their own country, and they're going to be shipped to where? To Babylon. This is the 70-year captivity that we've marked here. 70-year captivity by Babylon through King Nebuchadnezzar. They're already living in the glorious land before that. They're going to be taken from that land and put into Babylon. But at the end of the 70 years, what's going to happen to them? They're going to go back home, aren't they? Back to the glorious land. So if we think about Babylon, and Babylon is Europe. When we go from Babylon, we're going into the glorious land. If we're thinking about Egypt, we're going into the glorious land. So we have two stories that both line up, and they're taking God's people from the world or captivity and taking them home. Now, if you were to go to the story of Egypt, we know that there's a time prophecy that brings them from Egypt into the glorious land. It's the 400 or 430-year time prophecy that was given to Abraham. I think we're all familiar with that, or at least heard about it. So there's a time prophecy that takes you from Egypt into the glorious land, and there's a time prophecy that takes you from Babylon into the glorious land. And the time prophecy that does that, we've marked here, the 2520, the 1260, and the 1290. So you have these time prophecies that bring you to this point, and that point is 1798. So I want us to be certain and sure that 1798 is a solid waymark that takes you from a position of captivity to a position of freedom. So hopefully we've established that point. If we were to go to Daniel 11, verse 40, this date, 1798, is marked as being the time of the end. So we have a marker here that 1798 is the time of the end. God's people are going to be taken out of captivity into a place of freedom. So the other point that we connected was, if in Revelation 17, verse 5, this woman here, who's riding the beast, the kings of the earth, is called Mystery Babylon, and God's people, the Pilgrim Fathers, are going to come out of Babylon and go into the Promised Land, then what are they coming out of? They're coming out of Babylon. So there must be a call to come out of Babylon. And that call to come out of Babylon, we can read very clearly in Revelation 18, verse 4, which says, "Come out of her, Babylon, my people." And so those people who are coming out of Babylon in the year 1798, we can identify as being the Pilgrim Fathers. We've just done that. But Sardis. So Sardis comes out of Babylon. So we made that connection. Hopefully that's relatively clear. But this is Revelation 18, verse 4. And Revelation 18, verse 4 wasn't fulfilled way back here in 1798, was it? It wasn't. So there must be a call that's being made to come out of this system into this system that's being made in 1798. And where would we go to find that call? Where would you go to look for that call? Someone saying, come out of that system and come into this system. Come out of that environment, that situation, into this one. Revelation 14, verses 6 and 7. So in Revelation 14, verses 6 and 7, you have an angel flying in the midst of heaven saying, "Fear God, give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, And that's what we've marked here, isn't it? Revelation 14, 6 and 7. It's on the board, 1798. So Revelation 14, 6 and 7 is what? It's a call to come out of Babylon. Yes? Come out of her, my people. So however we want to look at the words of Revelation 14, 6 and 7, the concept or the principle behind that is to come out of captivity. Hopefully we can see that. So I've given 3 histories now that talk about a coming out. What are the 3 histories that we've mentioned? Egypt, this one here. Babylon, which is this one here, Nebuchadnezzar. And the third one was the 1260. So we can, hopefully there are enough people who walk through that logic, so it seems to be settled in our minds, that we have 3 histories which are all identical, which are leading to the same point. Now we know that upon the testimony of 2 or 3 a thing is established. So it's an established principle that at the time of the end there's a call to do what? To come out. To come out of a system that is satanic. The first one, Egypt, that was literal. They were literally in the land. The second one was literal. They were literally in the land. The third one was literal. Even though it was symbolically Babylon, it was literal, wasn't it? They're coming out of one geographical area and moving to another. Yes? So some people might stumble over this third one, which was Europe. It's not literally Babylon, obviously, but it's geography. So you move from one geographical place to another. Now, when we're going to make an application at the end of the world, which is the time of the end, I'll put it here, time of the end. I've suggested that this is 1989. We'll demonstrate that in a moment. What are we saying? The primary waymark, or the primary, should I say, the primary characteristic of this waymark here of the time of the end is what? There's a call to come out of Babylon, or a system that's held you captive, or could I say, has captivated you. Is there a difference between held captive and being captivated? Yes, so they're both captive, but you can see that depending on how you want to express the statement, one is voluntary and one is, slavery or subjugation. So I'm saying that at the time of the end, you find a situation or dynamic that God's people have been held captive by the world. And you can identify the world as being Babylon or Egypt. They're both symbols of the world. This captivity wasn't done in a moment. It took 70 years in that story here. It took 400 years in this history here. It took over 1,000 years in this history here. So we find ourselves in a place at the end of the world where we, God's people, have been led into captivity by Babylon. So before I go and prove the connection between these two, what I want us to see is this. Just in this line here that we've got from 1798 to the Sunday Law, in 1798 there was a call to come out of captivity, wasn't there? Yes? Did God's people, Sardis, Protestant America, come out of captivity? They did. But the woman, the mother, the whore, isn't going to let her daughter escape so easily. She has a long arm that can stretch across the Atlantic, and she grabs hold of her daughter and she says, "Not so fast." Takes her quite a while. In fact, it takes her how many years? Only 46 years, which is quite a long time, to grab hold of her daughter and bring her back home. Yeah? So what we're identifying that is in the year 1844, April, if you want to be specific about the month, that the mother has grabbed hold of her daughter and says, "That was very naughty, leaving home like that. We need to bring you back home." But the daughter doesn't want to go back to Europe, does she? No. So she cuts a deal with her mother and says, "Okay, I'll come back home, but what we'll do is we'll set up shop in the new land, in the new world, not in the old." So the mother agrees to that. So right back here in 1844, you have this dynamic that the daughter begins to sit upon the land, and there begins a church-state relationship, which Jesus, right there and then, stamps upon. Or should we say, begins to stamp upon. As time progresses, this daughter is going to be joined by her mother at the end of the world, where we're going to get not just this small-scale affair that's happening between the Europeans and the United States, but this becomes a worldwide phenomena. And that's what we want to discuss in the next few moments. So I want us to see that way back here in 1844, long before any of us were born, this land lost its title of being called Protestant America because the Americans stopped protesting. And we've been brought up as Adventists not even realizing that, thinking this is the land of freedom, and it's not, because this has been the land of captivity all the way back since 1844. But the Americans were really wise, because just prior to 1798, depending on how far you want to go back, 1776, plus or minus a few years, they set up a system that was so strong that even though the daughter began to take control and sit on this country, the institutions were set up so strongly that for 100 plus years, Americans didn't even realize what was happening. And of course, what are we speaking of? Separation of church and state. So the institutions that were developed in the Constitution were set up in such a fashion, they're so strong that it's been extremely difficult for the daughter here to properly sit upon the United States in the relationship that her mother had here back at the end of the world. But as time has progressed, that relationship has only gone from strength to strength. And it happened so subtly that when this relationship was firmly established, nobody even understands that it's happened. And today, Adventists are still waiting, aren't we? What are we waiting for? We call it the Sunday law. We're waiting for the Sunday law, but the Sunday law is just a code word for what? For the church and state, for this relationship. So we're waiting for Protestant America, or as my brother said, apostate Protestantism, to join hands with the United States government to begin to do something. So we're waiting for a future event. And Adventists will tell you, we're not quite sure when it's going to happen, but we know it's going to happen sometime. Could happen tomorrow. Maybe it might happen tomorrow. Could it happen tomorrow? Can't happen tomorrow, can it? Yeah? Can we prophesy for sure with 100% unerring accuracy that it cannot happen tomorrow? Yes, we should be able to say yes. If we understand end time prophecy, we should be able to assert it cannot happen tomorrow, because we already know there's at least 2 or 3 major events that have to occur before the Sunday law can happen. But Adventists are clueless of all of that, and they have no idea it could happen tomorrow, it could happen in 100 years. We have no markers to identify when it's going to happen. But what I want us to see is that what we're expecting, which is the relationship between the church and the state, which is a future event according to Adventists, has already happened. And what was it, 170 years and counting? Around that kind of number. It already happened 170 years ago. The church and the state got together way back here in 1844, and it's only gone from bad to worse since then. So what we're looking for is not the beginning of this relationship, but the tail end of it. And because we don't realize that or fully appreciate it, we come to grave mistakes in our understanding of end-time prophecy. So that's the first thing I want us to see. So here we have Christ with one foot here upon the sea, stamping them here, again here on the United States, on the land, begin to dealing with the issue that's occurring in 1844, and that history is going to be repeated at the end of the world. How do we know the dynamics that occurred from 1798 to 1844? That's the history that we've got here. And I'm saying that history is this history here. How does it get repeated at the end of the world? What is our logic or our premise to be able to identify how that happens? So Daniel 11:40. Seven thunders. So we're going to have to understand both of those concepts. We read about the seven thunders in Revelation 10, if you remember, from verse 3, and we'd go onward. So it's the issue of the seven thunders, and it's the issue of Daniel 11, verse 40. So let's quickly do 11:40. Let's have a look at that. So let's read Daniel 11, verse 40. I'm not going to take us to all the Spirit of Prophecy quotes that help us in defining when the time of the end is. But Ellen White explicitly teaches that the time of the end that's been identified here is 1798. So I'm just going to say that as a fact. I'm not going to prove that. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. He shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So if we go back to the beginning of the verse, it identifies someone called the king of the south. Hopefully we can see that. Now if we were to go not only to the beginning of Daniel 11, but we were to go to other Bible passages, other Old Testament books, we would see that there's a system that's been identified that is all connected to geography. This is Israel, or Canaan, or Palestine, depending on how you want to understand it. It's also identified as Kol Syria, which is essentially a strip of land that's bordered on one side by the Mediterranean Sea. So this would be the Mediterranean Sea over here, and on the other side by the Arabian Desert or the Arabian Peninsula, or what we might call Saudi Arabia today. There was a fertile land strip that was bordered by the Mediterranean one side and the River Jordan, and a little bit over on the other side. So if you can conceptualize the geography of the Middle East. And south of that is North Africa or Egypt. And north of that is Syria. And east of that is Babylon or Iraq. The reason why the Babylonians are called the people from the land of the north, or the king of the north, is because when they used to come and either dealt with Israel or the Egyptians, they couldn't cross the Arabian desert, so they'd go from east to the north, or westward, if I could just do it simply. They go from the east to the west, come into Syria, and then drop down. If you've got a map in the back of your Bible, you can see the geography of that. So they call the king of the north, or the people from the north, because they're always going to come from the direction of the north. There's a connection between the Syrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians. So when we think about this terminology that we've just read, the king of the south, in verse 40, we've got the king of the south and we've got the king of the north. Both terms, both phrases, they're all to do with geography. So this is the south and this is the north. If you get to Daniel 11, the first few verses of the chapter, it begins in verse 1, "And I in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him." So Daniel 11 verse 1, which kingdom is reigning here? This is the Medes and the Persians on a simple level. This is the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians are the second empire in Bible prophecy. It starts with Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece. Within the next few verses, and we'd probably go to verse 3, "And the mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion, and he shall do according to his will." Who is this mighty king? This is Alexander the Great, mighty king that shall stand up. And we're not just guessing that. If you went back to Daniel 8, you could see how these symbols all tie together. So from verse 1 to verse 3, it's transitioned from Medo-Persia to Greece. I want us to see that connection. As soon as you get to Greece, we're into verse 4. "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven." So these four winds of heaven is portrayed in a number of different ways. It's here. We can see this leopard creature with four heads, having four wings, all a symbol of Greece. This is the four generals of Alexander the Great. I think we're all familiar with that. And through intrigue and warfare, it goes from four kings or four generals to two. And you end up getting two dynasties. You get the Seleucid dynasty in the north, and you get the Ptolemaic dynasty in the south. And throughout the chapter, this term, king of the south, king of the north, for most of Daniel 11, is dealing with Greece, the struggle between the internal politics of Greece and the rise and fall of those two elements. So we could call this civil war. So if we would describe this as civil war between the northern part of Greece and the southern part of Greece. When I say Greece, I'm not talking about geographically, I'm talking about an empire. So hopefully we can conceptualize that and can understand that. So we know that after Greece, you get pagan Rome. Yep, we know that. Straightforward. So Daniel 11 is going to show us the transition from Greece to pagan Rome. As pagan Rome begins to take over, it's going to have to deal with three geographical areas. What are the three geographical areas? It's on the board. Syria, the promised land or the glorious land, and Egypt. It's going to deal with all of these three. And that history is brought to view in Daniel chapter 8 verse 9, which we won't read. Daniel chapter 8 verse 9 is the history of how pagan Rome begins to subjugate and take control of Greece towards the very end. Once it does that, First, it's going to do that in a number of steps. So the first attack, if I use that phrase, is when it takes down Macedonia in 168. So I'll just put the number down just in case we may not be familiar with them. 168 BC, pagan Rome is going to subjugate Macedonia, or the literal land of Greece. This is at the Battle of Pydna. This is 168 BC. Once it's done that, it still hasn't really finished the work of subjugating Greece. In fact, it's only really begun. Then it's going to take down Syria. Then it's going to take down Israel, which I'll call the Glorious Land. And then eventually, finally, it's going to take down Egypt. And by the time it's taken down Egypt, we've got to the year 31 BC, the Battle of Actium. Everybody's familiar with the Battle of Actium? Mark Antony and Cleopatra. We've all heard those stories. Do we know Cleopatra was Grecian? She wasn't Egyptian. Yeah? Everybody knows that? Yeah? Yes. She's a Grecian princess. She's not a native Egyptian. So here we are in 31 BC. Egypt has been taken, and Egypt was the very last part of Greece. So if you're going to use this chart here, you've gone from Greece to pagan Rome, you might mark that line here as being 31 BC, the Battle of Actium. Greece is finally annihilated. When that work has been done, the king of the south essentially just goes out of history. There's now a supreme ruler, which is whom? It's pagan Rome, and he's taken the title of the King of the North. He took the title of the King of the North a long time ago, not when he took down Egypt. He's been the King of the North for a long time. Yes? Sorry? Since Syria fell, you think when Syria fell he took the title of the King of the North?
Before that, Syria would have been the King of the North in Daniel 11.
Let me ask you a question then. In Daniel 11 verse 40, which we've just read, so I'll jump ahead. You've got verse 40, verse 41, and verse 42. This is the first territory, the second territory, and the third territory. King of the South, glorious land, the world, or Egypt. 1, 2, 3. And who's going to take all of that over? King of the North. So, if the King of the North became the King of the North when he took down the first obstacle, it wasn't the King of the North before it took down the first obstacle, would it? Yeah? So if you're going to mark the King of the North here as being the King of the North when it takes down the first obstacle here, because this was the first, second, and third. You agree with that? If pagan Rome became the King of the North here, it wasn't the King of the North before.
Syria had the title of King of the North.
I understand that. But if you bring in this verse, in verse 40 it says the King of the North is going to do something. It's going to do what? Part B. It's going to take down this empire. So Rome must be identified as being the King of the North before it takes down its first territory. This one. If you're going to use a triple application of prophecy, you have to have the model fitting all the way through. So it would have to have been done here, it would have had to have been done here, and it would have had to also been done for the papacy. If that was too much for some people, I'll just leave it. It was just... When is papal Rome going to take down its three territories? The Heruli, Vandals, and Ostrogoths. Yeah? And I don't know what dates you give for these. This is 538. What date do you give for this one? 4, 7-3? Okay. So when does the papacy become the king of the north? So my sister said 538 here. So if it became the king of the north here, then at the end of the world, we're saying that it became king of the north here when it took down its third territory. And in this one, we're saying it became the king of the north when it took down its first. So we've got all these different models if we're going to do that. I'll give you a clue. In Revelation 13, verse 2, the dragon gave to the beast its power, seat, and great authority. Familiar with that? The sea is the throne. You familiar with that? When did it receive the throne? Constantine, 330 AD. So Constantine, leaving the city of Rome, leaving his seat, moves to Turkey, and with that he left his title, the King of the North. So I would say that the papacy became the King of the North in 330 AD, 200 years before it rules supremely. It receives its title long before that.
So it receives its title before it actually has the power to.
Yes. And if you're going to run that through this history, the words already tell you that modern Rome is already the King of the North before 1989, before it takes out its first territory. So you have two histories that demonstrate that, which would mean in this history here, pagan Rome must have already taken the title of the King of the North before it took down the Syrian Empire in 64-65 AD.
And we do know that they were already the dominant power before they actually conquered Syria. Syria was already in trouble.
Yeah, they were already what we might call a vassal state when Pompey goes and sorts out the problem that's there. Okay, so sorry about that digression. We've got the King of the North and the King of the South. They're both Grecian. Civil war. By the time you get to 31 BC, this is the Battle of Actium, pagan Rome has totally subjugated the Grecian Empire. So in this picture here, you've got this hard line. Can we see that? In real life, it doesn't work that way. In real life, it takes a long time to transition from Greece to pagan Rome. Well over 100 years. Takes a long time. So going into Daniel 11, verse 24, once pagan Rome has taken Actium, it's now going to rule supremely. And it says for a time. How long is the time? 360 years. So this takes us from 31 BC to 330 AD, which is a time 360 years. After it's ruled supremely for a time, who's going to take over? This is pagan Rome. Who takes over from pagan Rome? Papal Rome. So after it's ruled supremely, it's going to be taken over by the papacy. But it spent, I'll do it dotted here, a long time here to transition. There was a transition period before it ruled supremely. There's a transition period here for the papacy, which is approximately how long? 200 years. Sorry? Yeah? 200 years? Because we went from 330 to 530. So there's a transition here, approximately 200 years, that's going to take you to a place where the papacy is now going to rule supremely for 530 to 1798, 1260 years. So you can see the pattern, hopefully, of how that happens. But what I want us to see is that here in 31, when Greece was taken out of the picture, that the king of the south, which was what nation? Which was what nation? The geography was Egypt, but what nation? Greece. Yeah, this is the Grecian Empire, the Grecian nation. It's Egypt geographically, but they've taken that land. When that happened here in 31, and the Romans took over, what happened to the king of the south? So was Rome a unified empire? It was. Right from the very beginning, it had absolute control over its entire territory. There wasn't internal division until you get to the very end, where it all begins to unravel and break apart. Yes? Yes. So once the king of the south is taken out, which was part of this history, from this history onward, you've got the king of the north, which is pagan Rome, and there is no king of the south. The king of the south is a subject of history because it takes control of Egypt and the whole of the then known world, and it's going to rule supremely. But as time continues, it's going to transition from pagan Rome to papal Rome. Still the king of the north, no king of the south. So we're going to have to wait till we get all the way down to the end here, because by the time you get to 1798, what do we know that we have? You know you have the king of the south because it tells you in verse 40, the king of the south. So we have to get to a place where king of the south was here. It's been dead for a long time. If it's been dead, what does it need to do to come back here? It needs to resurrect. So we'll put the king of the south here, and I'll put an R with it. The R representing resurrection. It's the resurrection of the king of the south. Who died here? The king of the south. The king of the south was Greece, but what geography was it? Egypt. So if the king of the south is Egypt, when it resurrects, what's it going to be? Egypt. It has to be Egypt, because if Egypt dies here, it has to be resurrected as Egypt, as the king of the south. So now it's still Egypt. So here we are in 1798, and we've got the king of the south that's not been around for an awful long time, is being resurrected. So,
is it spiritually Egypt? So it would be France?
Of course, everything's spiritual. Let's go to Revelation chapter 11. Because the Bible's going to even answer that one for us. It will tell us. Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. No, actually, maybe I don't want to read verse 8. I want to read, let me find the verse. Oh, yeah, yes, I found the verse. We're going to read we'll read verse 8 first, because you mentioned the word spiritually. And their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. So can we see Egypt? Egypt's brought to view here, and it's spiritually. So it's not literally. So it says the great city. So we've got the great city. And this great city is what? How many cities really is it? 2 cities. It's the city of Sodom, and it's the city of Egypt. So what you need to do is you need to go back into Old Testament history and see what's so special about Sodom and what's so special about Egypt. What's so unique about them that they're going to be brought to view at the end of the world. And if they're going to be brought to view at the end of the world, what are they going to be? What's going to happen to them? They're going to be resurrected. So we made a connection here between Egypt and Egypt resurrected here, king of the south, because we're in 1798. But now we've introduced another city, not just Egypt. I've called Egypt a city, but obviously a land. But it's also introducing Sodom, my sister.
So is it the practices that were done in those cities, like the darkness that was going on?
Yes, so we have to see characteristics that were going on in those cities to see what are those, because there's lots of things happening. We have to identify in a succinct way what are the characteristics that would mark Sodom and what are the characteristics that would mark Egypt that we're going to bring into the end of the world in 1798 to make a marker. But we're going to read verse 7. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them. So in verse 7, what's it identifying? A beast. We can see that. There was a beast that comes out of the pit. So I'm suggesting that the beast is the great city, is Sodom and Gomorrah. So I put Sodom and Gomorrah together because they're not just one. Sodom and Egypt, sorry. All of these two symbols, the great city, Sodom and Egypt, are another way of expressing the term beast, or a power that's going to do something. And what does this beast do? Comes out of the bottomless pit. If we were to check what Ellen White says about a bottomless pit, what's the definition of what bottomless pit means? I'll find the passage during the break because we're gonna stop now. But the bottomless pit, someone.
Doesn't she say something about it, the condition of the earth was before?
Okay, so my understanding is the phrase bottomless pit, and it occurs 3 times in the scriptures for 3 different powers. This is one of them. Do we know what the other one is? Islam is another one. Do we know what the other one is? It's the papacy, Rome. 3 people identify, 3 groups, 3 powers identify that. The bottomless pit is, I'm suggesting, a new manifestation of satanic power. So that's what I want to identify a bottomless pit as. So I put equals there, so that's what I'm understanding it to be. It's a new manifestation of satanic power. Does that sound right? I think it does, because we've got King of the South, which was the manifestation of what kind of a power? Satanic power. But now it's been resurrected, so we've got a resurrection. Same power is being resurrected, but it's not the same. Let me rephrase it. It's not just the same, but it's different. There's something new about it. It's a new manifestation of satanic power. That's why it's identifying that it comes out of a bottomless pit. So it's the same, because it's Egypt and Egypt. It says it's Egypt, but there's something new about it. And the thing that's new about it is that it's not some country in the Middle East. It's some country in Europe, and it's all symbolic. But it's going to pick up those same characteristics. So when you see a bottomless pit, it's something that's already there in the past, but when it resurrects, there's something new or different about it. That's what I want us to see, this phrase, bottomless pit. So what we're going to identify is that in 1798, the king of the south, Egypt, springs out of nowhere. It's exactly the same as it was before, Egypt, but it's new. It's a new manifestation, and it's satanic. We'll close there, and
GC 268.3.
thank you. GC 268.3. You want to just read that phrase, and then we'll close.
But yeah, it says, but here is brought to view a new manifestation of satanic power.
Okay, so it says the bottomless pit is a new manifestation of satanic power. I'm saying that's the definition of what that symbol means. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness, your watch care over us. We ask and pray that you would be with us, guide us and bless us as we enjoy fellowshipping on your holy Sabbath day and meditate upon the thoughts and ideas that you are showing us through your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.